I'm Matt.
And I'm Nate.
And this is Not Quite Religious, a podcast where a Christian pastor and former evangelical turned atheist have conversations about faith, religion, philosophy, and life while drinking coffee.
Welcome to episode 26, where we don't have a new coffee. But on our commercial break, so to speak, when me and Matt were hanging out outside, we started talking about evangelism based on our last episode and Mormonism and Jehovah's Witnesses and prophecy, and we weren't going to record a second episode today, but just because we've done two like no theological, like let's just show them who we are episodes. And
yeah,
I think we were both feeling like it was time to have something of more substance, and didn't think we had it until we were outside and I was vaping. We started talking. I was like, let's get in and record. So,
but first, can I just say, like, the next time you have a coffee that's like below a 7 on the scale, like maybe not pour me 16 ounces of it.
You don't have to drink it all.
I'm just playing. I'm just giving you a hard time.
I mean, the brewer makes as much as it makes, man. But yes, I normally by this point I've finished my coffee and I've moved on to seltzer. And I don't know if you guys can hear that, but I still have quite a bit of coffee in my tumbler.
Yeah.
So having drank more of the Mary Lou's coffee, number one, it's not what I remembered, which potentially they changed their thing. Maybe I didn't brew it right, but I would prefer a Dunkin's coffee.
I don't know if I'd go that far, but it's been a long time since I had Dunkin's like black.
Well, so I don't drink it black. Starbucks is 25 minutes away from here, and we used to on weekends make the trip. It's like a special Starbucks run. And we'd get all the kids something, and like they liked like the chai tea. Like we weren't buying them coffee, but me and Shirley would get like coffees. And it was costing us like $60 to get all the kids and myself and Shirley something. And there's a Dunkin's literally a 5-minute walk from the house. And I was like, screw it, we'll try it. And Dunkin's cold brew with cream and some like vanilla swirl is pretty tasty.
Yeah.
I mean, it's like
cream and vanilla swirls.
Where it's at. But I would rather that than this.
Yeah, I would rather have vanilla swirl and cream.
So, I apologize. I mean, this coffee is not going to get brewed even on my worst days anymore. Maybe I'll save it for a catering event or something because it's definitely going to be better than whatever people are used to.
I thought this was going to be the week because you made such a big deal about it.
Yeah.
I thought you found a Mary Lou's coffee, emptied it into another container.
Oh, yeah, no.
Put Dunkin' in it, and that it was going to be like really, really good coffee.
So maybe next week what I should do is empty this.
I'm totally
empty
prepared.
the Dunkin's.
You should have never told me because every week that it's your coffee, I'm like,
Wait, I mean, didn't you see me open it? Oh,
totally. I didn't.
Okay.
I was
like literally opened it while you were here. I think the back seal, but
I was laser focused on hearing about your week.
Yeah, I appreciate that. You were paying attention. So anyway, when we were outside, you were relating. Because we were talking about door-to-door evangelism a little bit in the last episode, and you were talking about an experience you had with some Mormons. Mm-hmm. So do you want to sort of catch the...
I used to love, actually, when Mormons would come to the door, because it didn't feel, interestingly enough, like that much of an interruption. I mean, if I was doing something, it would have been, but it's different. For some reason, for me, it's different than, like, and maybe it's because of my background, but a guy that has a t-shirt on that says, hell is real. It's like... I don't want to have a conversation with that guy, but every experience I've had with Mormons, there's like a willingness to talk about actual theology that can be interesting. So if they let it happen.
I've had 3 denominations come to my door in Amherst: Mormons, Jehovah's Witnesses, and ICC. Mm-hmm. Which ICC, at least when I was in college, was known more of as a cult.
Yeah, what is ICC?
International Church of Christ.
Okay.
Yeah. And they would do things like on campus called like love hugs, where they would like literally find someone walking alone and surround them. And we can get into that because I want to hear your story first. But I all that to say, I find Mormons the most enjoyable.
Okay.
Of the 3.
Yeah. I want to talk about ICC too. That's interesting. But so I always had like a good time with the Mormons, and I always made the mistake of like offering them coffee, and I forgot that Mormons don't do caffeine.
Oh yeah. Can they? Is it just is it caffeine or is it just coffee? I thought they could do tea.
I feel like
potentially.
I feel like it's caffeine.
Yeah.
Well, they refused. I would be like, "You guys want some coffee?" And they just kind of looked at me like showed me what they were wearing.
Yeah,
you know. Like,
but I mean, that's also a presumption on
have
their
a
part
name
because
tag.
I think you would only know that because you're in, especially in New England. Like,
right.
I don't think the average person knows that Mormons can't have tobacco or alcohol. Or
That's
caffeine.
true. That's true. This was in Pennsylvania. But,
Okay, so maybe a little more.
But then I was like, okay, I have soda, and they were like,
not all soda has caffeine.
I know, but they refused that too. So I was just like, water? You guys want water? And they took water. But, yeah, there was this one, because they always come in pairs, right? And there was this one that stands out to me, and I wish I could remember their names. I'll just call them. I'll call them John and Bob.
Oh, I was gonna say you should come up with like some real fundamentalist names like Abraham and
Abe and Elijah.
There you go.
So Abraham was the there's always like a trainer,
Yeah.
and like a trainee. So there's always like a guy who's taking out the younger one to learn the ropes. So like Abe was the mentor and Elijah was the mentee, and I picked up right away that they were two very different personalities, and maybe Abraham was like a talkable guy, but in real life, but he was definitely on a mission.
Yeah.
As the trainer, and
check the boxes, say the things.
yeah,
walk them down the
get
wrong
out of here
road.
because we got to get to as many people.
Yeah. I mean, we're baptizing them all anyway, so.
Right.
Right? I mean, because like, odds are people on this podcast have been baptized into the Mormon church and just don't know it.
Yeah.
Like, they do that.
I didn't know they did that.
Yeah, they do, like, proxy baptisms because they believe it actually saves. So they'll have a Mormon in good standing, like, stand in for other people.
Yeah.
And they'll, like, get baptized again, but they'll get baptized for these other 100 people whose names are read.
That's crazy.
And it's a way that, like, Mormons believe it saves you from hell. So they prefer that you convert on your own, and that allows you to potentially have your own planet and be a new Adam or be a new Jesus.
Yeah.
But they're saving the entire world from their hell because they're, like I believe
Right.
Ancestry.com is Mormon, and part of the reason they started it, and I might be wrong about that one, but they have some of the best ancestry records because they're literally baptizing people like even backwards in time. So they're like trying to track every human being on earth to baptize them.
That's crazy. Can you request to like? Can I be like, I don't want to join the Church of Latter-day Saints?
Yeah, there is like a formal process,
But would you just go ahead and baptize me? I don't have to know about it.
No. There've been people who've like written them letters like, please don't baptize me.
Yeah.
Like, I want nothing to do with your either hocus pocus or your satanic ritual.
Yeah.
But I don't know. I'm sure you could request that they baptize you via proxy. It's like a fire insurance.
So I don't want to know about it. I trust you.
I'm sure that, dude, you met people. I'm sure you've already been baptized.
Right. I'm good then.
Yeah.
I hope I get the name Abraham.
You already got Matthew. It's like,
Yeah, fair enough.
Sorry.
But no,
Abe and Ellie.
So Abe and Ellie, and Ellie's like a real personable guy, like an extrovert, like is excited to be there just for the sheer. I don't think he was as excited about the evangelism as he was like just the kind of guy that likes to talk to strangers and meet new people and learn new interesting things. So we're sitting there drinking our coffee and water and just having this great conversation, and Abe is not feeling it because he's not there to have a deep theological conversation. He's there to do conversion or not and then move on to the next house. But like Elijah's really trying to persuade me that Mormonism is real. Normally what they'll do is like if they discover that you're resistant to it, which obviously I was resistant to being a Mormon, they'll just go, here, we'll leave you a Book of Mormon and you
bye-bye.
Read this part and you'll just know something will happen to you. You'll
have the witness of the Holy Spirit.
Yeah, and you'll be like, oh yeah, I believe all this. But like I clearly wasn't going there, and one of the things that we ended up talking about theologically was the issue of prophecy and like how prophets actually work, and I just reminded them that there is such a thing in the Bible as false prophets. Like, first of all, in Deuteronomy 18, your prophecies have to like come true.
Well, because one of their arguments is Joseph Smith was a prophet,
right?
So how can you deny,
right,
the divine inspiration of Mormonism if Joseph Smith was a prophet?
And what I can do is, well, I can compare Joseph Smith to the revelation already received, and to the examples of false prophets that exist versus the examples of like, real prophets. And so we had that conversation. I will say that since then, I probably have a more nuanced take on that. I'm less doctrinaire than I was when I had that conversation. Yeah. I was Reformed at the time. So that particular conversation, when it happened probably circa 2008, was a lot different than like if a Mormon came now.
Yeah.
But when we were talking outside, what I brought up was like, that whole way of dealing with things is like, here's the thing about prophets though, is like, one, they're never honored in their hometown. Like every single prophet in the Old Testament, not every single one, but most of the prophets in the Old Testament, the establishment was like, you can't talk anymore.
Right.
And if they kept talking, they were martyred or imprisoned or killed or whatever. And then the other thing that I brought up, and that's when you were like immediately quit vaping. we have an episode now. Let's do this. Was when I brought up the counterpoint, which is like, well, wasn't Jesus like? Couldn't he be construed as a false prophet of Judaism?
When you were talking, I was immediately like, well, Jewish people would say that Jesus like words didn't get fulfilled, and like the proof, like the way that he died itself was proof enough that he was like
Right, which is why Paul was so, strained in his arguments to try and prove that Jesus was a legitimate, like, not just Greek, sort of Messiah, but like was the Jewish Messiah that the prophets of the Old Testament.
And I think as an
talking
atheist,
about.
And a lot of atheists would point to the two biggest failed prophecies of Jesus. One, that he would rebuild the temple, and two, that he would come back. It's like...
Well, come back is like, that one can't ever be disproved because...
You can't prove a negative.
Right.
But, I mean...
Right, and then the other one was, the text tells us that Jesus meant it metaphorically, that he was speaking of his body, and that was the fulfillment of that prophecy.
I mean, yes and no. We have to...
But that's the thing, though, for me that gets hard when people, which is why, another reason why I'm not enamored with apologetics is one of the arguments will be like, well, look at all the prophecies that Jesus fulfilled. And first of all, like, all the prophecies that Jesus fulfilled are interpreted and contained in a self-contained book that you call the Bible. And so you can basically say anything that happened is a fulfillment, literally or metaphorically, of this thing that was already compiled and written. So it's already biased from the beginning. And also, just like the example that I said, it's like, you can say that you're going to do this. I'm going to destroy the temple and rebuild it in 3 days, or X, or anything else. And then always, when it doesn't come to pass, say, well, in retrospect, you can always go back. You can always go back and say it was a metaphor.
Right.
You can always do that.
Yeah. So, yeah, and on that too, like the freedom the New Testament writers feel they can have with Old Testament prophets.
Yeah.
I think a lot of Christians, when they read probably most Christians who read the Bible, my guess would be they spend far more time in the New Testament than the Old.
Correct.
And if they're in the Old, it's like Genesis, the first half of Exodus, skip all the rest of it.
Yeah.
Because number one, not pertinent, right? Like, we have a new law, so it doesn't matter. Also, like, Numbers is boring and confusing, and I can't pronounce these names. Maybe you read some Ruth and some Esther. You're probably not reading Judges, maybe a little bit of Joshua.
Right,
The prophets, I think most Christians are just...
Yeah.
Probably, maybe the first 6 chapters is Isaiah,
Daniel.
But when you get into what, like, if you were to go to the verses that, Matthew's like, in accordance with Scripture, and like there's that little footnote that says, it's Malachi, verse 4, chapter 4, verse 1, whatever.
Right.
And you go to that verse, you're like, that has nothing to do with like, I would never get Jesus out of that.
Right.
And then you have to realize, like, well, it's actually a translation from the Septuagint, and even then they're taking
That's what I was going to say.
But even then they're taking freedom.
Right.
So like these verses in the New Testament that I would say, like, they're like, oh, look, it's a prophecy. Like, you'd never get it's a prophecy unless in hindsight you need to make it fit.
Right.
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 So like, and that's the trick with prophecy is you can always look back and be like, oh, the Jewish people thought that this was actually the prophecy.
Right.
Right. But it was actually over here instead.
And when you read it in its original form, you go, well, of course they thought that was the prophecy. Because, like, that's the common sense interpretation. Right. It's weird how the Jewish people always seem to have the common sense interpretation.
Like the Isaiah of, like, he'll be broken and forsaken. Like,
yeah.
Like, in context, it really seems like Isaiah is writing about himself.
or Israel.
Or, yeah.
And which is the most common rabbinical interpretation.
Right.
Is like that this is an interpretation of like Israel's history and their role in the world as the one who basically falls on the sword,
right?
Instead of the pagans falling on the sword,
yeah,
right. So, and of course, if you wanted to create a new religion out of Judaism, you would borrow from that because that's a palpable idea,
right?
So, well, no, it's not actually Israel; it's Jesus. Jesus is the one who fell on the sword for the sake of not just the pagans, but also the Jewish people
right.
who thought that they were more righteous because,
right,
they were Jews or whatever.
And you're Jewish, and you feel like you're falling on the sword again under Roman rule. What if I told you that's not actually the correct interpretation? Right. This guy actually fell on the sword, and he rose from the dead, and he'll let you do it too. So instead of getting constantly trodden by Alexander the Great and the amount of kingdoms that have ruled Israel.
Right.
Like, instead of them ruling you, you can actually have ultimate victory in heaven when Jesus will come back and destroy all those kingdoms.
Right.
That's pretty appealing.
Well, that's it. Like, I don't think that you just gave an unfair summation. I mean, it was a generalization, but I don't think it's an unfair summation of how I understand what Christian theology is.
Right.
What the New Testament is actually trying to say. And I think the dominant figure for me in the New Testament in terms of like, obviously the theme is Jesus, but like the dominant figure of the New Testament in terms of how theology ended up developing and what points we hone in on is the Apostle Paul.
Yeah.
Like he was the thinker. He thought Christianity. It's like Jesus did some stuff, and it's just like with anything else. A person can. There's always the question, say even of the Beatles, right? Like, you can't take away the fact that the Beatles recorded all of that stuff, but at least half the reason the Beatles are the Beatles is because people wouldn't stop writing about the Beatles, right? Like, and then giving their opinion, who's the best, and like the biographies, or like maybe even a better example is the mythology of Kurt Cobain and Nirvana, where people cannot stop writing about the same thing. Yeah. Over and over again, and all it does is grow the mythos. Right. So Kurt did what Kurt did. He wrote great songs. They were great songs. He, that album that Nirvana came out with in 91, Nevermind, it changed the music landscape. It's like, it's a microcosm of like messianism and like revolutions, and it's something stupid like music, but it is a microcosm of how the world actually works. Now, then after he died, it was like, the shocking death. He didn't rise from the dead, but there are these ideas. There's like some people are like, no, he didn't actually commit suicide. He was murdered. Like, and now you have
he's alive and well with Tupac,
right? Like, and now there's 1 million articles and 1 million books and YouTube videos. It's never going to end. People are never ever going to stop talking about him. Yeah, and that's what the letters of Paul are in relation to Jesus. It's like, you could have just left it at this guy did some remarkable things for 3 years in Israel, and then he was crucified in this really tragic, sudden way. And there's some claims that maybe he did something crazy like rise from the dead. And it could have just like pittered out, but no, you had the Apostle Paul come along and say, no, I had my own dramatic conversion experience. And this is actually why I think that Jesus rising from the dead explains everything,
right,
about everything, right? So Paul gets, what I'm saying is, all I have to say is like Paul gets a lot of credit for the longevity of Christianity.
Yeah, well, I mean, like he rewrote Christianity from Judaism too. So like we forget about Peter and James, right? Like,
right, who were actually there when
right, but like you read the epistles of Peter and James, and they're so different than Paul.
Yeah,
and some like true religion is what in James, right?
Oh, you're saying even theologically,
yeah.
Not even just saying stylistically,
right? Like James is like, do you know how you're devout? Like you take care of the poor and the elderly and the sick, right? And Paul's like, no, it's not about works. And like, we can do some gymnastics or there's some theological explanation, but like fundamentally, if you were to give these two things to people who had no concept, of like Christian, which it would be like ridiculously difficult in this day and age, but like they would be like, these are two different religions, and in some way, like they both mention Jesus, so maybe you'd have to like blot out the names and change them, but like, like
I have the same experience when I read, which I haven't done as much as the Bible, obviously, but I have the same experience when I read Quran. Yeah, like within pages, I go,
well, I mean, so the Quran is interesting in that later revelation supersedes earlier revelation. Yeah. Right. So like, and reading it, like it's not meant to be read straight through. Like like you have to actually have some history of the Quran to know like it's this one and then this one and then this one, and really the only one that matters is the last one.
Yeah, I'm not saying that to discredit the Quran or Islam at all. I'm simply pointing out that like books that are considered scripture, for the most part, universally aren't. This theological idea that everything has to hold together with logical consistency is not something that I've ever, I don't think it has to be true in order for that scripture to have meaning or significance. Or
see, I guess maybe because I'm just like less transcendent than you, unless we're talking about food. Like in my comparative religion class in college, we read Job, the Bhagavad Gita, and gosh, what was the third? It was The Way of Lao Tzu by Thomas Merton. And like, I don't know if you're familiar with the Bhagavad Gita. It's a little bit, Hindu scripture, probably one of the more holy books, more like the Torah of Hinduism, I believe. And I read it, I'm like, this is bullshit. Yeah. Like, I'm like, it's just like, it's contradicting itself within its own text. It's like its whole premise is like ridiculous. Like, and by premise, I don't mean like multiple gods and battles. I'm just like the moral lesson in the end of it. I'm like, what? Yeah. So I'm like, well, that's just like clearly not true. So I can just discount it because it's so absolutely absurd. But clearly a billion people subscribe to it is not absurd.
And I wonder if they think about it that way. Yeah. Like, I wonder if that has anything to do with their thinking about what makes it credible or not. Right. You know?
I mean, no, because they're not Western, number one. Right. Right. I mean, it's the same with, like, I'm sorry, it's The Way of Cheng Sui, not Lao Tzu. Lao Tzu was Cheng Sui's mentor. But, like, you read The Way of Cheng Sui by Merton, which is, like, translations of some, like, the whole point of Confucianism is like, yes. It's like DBT, right? It's like both and. Neither, like two opposing, what appear to be diametrically opposed things can both be true. Right. Like, that's sort of Confucianism. Yeah.
I think that's a lot of Eastern spirituality.
Right. But that is, like, decidedly not Western. Right. 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 Because, like, we're... especially post-Enlightenment, like, if A, then B, if not A, then not B. And they're like, no, if not A, then B. It can also be a thing. And you're like, no, it can't.
But even within, I mean, I agree with you on a very superficial level, like that the preference for rigid logic is definitely, like, in the Western camp. Yeah. more than the Eastern camp in terms of philosophy. But if you can look within the Western tradition, and you pointed out Merton, and even like Eastern Christianity, like Greek Orthodox, Russian Orthodox, Eastern Orthodox, but even within early Catholicism, Middle Ages, plenty of mystical stuff in the Western tradition,
right,
where people aren't as concerned about logical consistency and doctrinal claims. It's there, and it's an important part of the Western tradition that I think the Enlightenment, and I'm actually reading a book about all this right now, so it's interesting. But the Enlightenment was both a development from within Western Christianity and also a critique of the Middle Ages. So that's sort of the space that we live in.
Yeah.
And that's a gross oversimplification of a lot of history. But back to your thing about like James and Paul, it's actually hard to disagree with you, especially when you look at, for you theology nerds, what Paul says in Romans 4 and what James says in James 2. So because in both places they're talking about Father Abraham. Mm-hmm. And Paul says, Abraham, we know, was not justified by works. Right. Because it says in Genesis, Abraham believed God and it was credited to him as righteousness. That's what it says in Genesis. And then James goes, was not our father Abraham justified by works when he put Isaac on? So I think that Western Reformed Protestant Christians who have this idea that it has to work because that's what makes it have to be true, like, that's where you have the mental gymnastics. Yeah. But there's also another option where you're like, well, that's what holy books do. Like, they're dialogues with each other. And I'm not saying that in a logical way. I mean, I'm so ignorant as to say in a logical way both those things can be true. That's not the argument I'm trying to make. Right. Nor am I trying to make an argument for why a certain view of biblical authority or inerrantism or inspiration can hold together with Paul saying that and James saying that. What I am saying is we can, in the 21st century, identify as Christians and have a conversation that goes like, we can use that to have a dialogue within ourselves. Yeah. And say you're still a Christian, you could be like, well, I kind of look at it the way more like I lean more towards James. And I can be like, well, I kind of lean more towards Paul. But that's it. Then we're done. It's like, and there's a conversation to be had about how works and faith interplay, but I think that's a different podcast.
Yeah, totally.
So that's the only point that I'll make about that is that there isn't, you don't have to read the Bible in a modern Western way. And for my money, probably shouldn't, because
it's not a modern Western book.
It's not a modern Western book.
Right. Yeah. So just to go back to false prophets, so clearly Joseph Smith, not a prophet, but we kind of hinted on the fact that I think most Jewish people reject Jesus as Messiah because what they're looking at is the prophecies of their book that say New Israel, New Temple, restoration of the kingdom, and they're like, Jesus didn't do those things. Right. And, Christians can, we can argue about whether he did spiritually or metaphorically or what texts, but just to kind of go back to street witnessing and Jehovah's Witnesses, because we are, believe it or not, coming against the clock, even though we normally talk a lot longer. So I also have had whimsical experiences with Mormons. And I think we mentioned this before. I had when I was part of Mercy House, we did this Taste of Amherst. It was it's a giant festival where all the restaurants come out to the common, and it's $1, $2 to taste, and you taste everything. And Mercy House did night security to make sure no one's got anything stolen. Well, one of the vendors was a Mormon, and they ended up staying with us and hanging out and talking. We didn't know they were Mormon at the time, and they invited us to their like motorcycle shop to play video games, and like for weeks we're playing Halo, and we're like talking and praying beforehand, and like we're going to evangelize this guy, and he's bringing his friends who are talking and praying beforehand, and they're Mormons. They're going to evangelize us. And they were great. They were good people and fun, and when the Mormons have come door to door, like very similar experiences where I'm like, this is a cool person. Jehovah's Witnesses, on the other hand, I've never had a good experience with. They've always been so angry and so grumpy, and maybe it's because I point out that like, there is such a thing as false prophets, and there was the great disappointment, and then there was the greater disappointment, and then there was Seventh-day Adventists and Jehovah's Witnesses. So like, like you're basing your sect of Christianity on literally false prophecy. Like the world is going to end this day, and people like selling all their possessions, and literally going up the top of a mountain to wait for Jesus, and he doesn't come back. And so Miller's like, oh, hang on a second, I forgot to carry the 2. And the next year they go up, and there's an alcoholic drunk at the bottom of the mountain who's like, he ain't coming. Right? And they have to walk back down to the mountain to this drunk being like, I told you. And you get 2 sects out of that. And I'm just like, how, like, I'm not super up on Joseph Smith's prophecies, but he did not predict the end of the world as far as I know in his lifetime, and was not wrong about that. Right. He
was not wrong about the end of the world. Yeah.
Which is like a pretty big, like, you're wrong.
Yeah. Yeah. And I'm not sure that you could find anything approaching like a real, like date. Like there's no date predictions in the New Testament. And actually most of the stuff that Jesus was talking about was echoing the way that the minor prophets that people don't read, the way they talk about apocalypse, which is like, I think intentionally not specific. So I always find it ironic when you have certain kind of Christians that try to specify.
Oh gosh! Those Christians are blowing up my Facebook feed. Like I've had to unfollow some for now because I'm just like, dude, I can't watch another Hunter Biden video and how this, like regardless politically, like how it actually like foretells the Antichrist. I'm like, dude, like,
and I actually don't think that's at all what the Bible is even like trying to say. Even giving it, like, not doing mental gymnastics. I think it's in plain sight that anybody who's taken a literature 101 course on anything can like read like Micah and go, he's talking metaphors. And maybe I just contradicted myself a little bit, but I'm actually just saying because earlier I said like the Jews have a very like common sense, but actually I think that goes with what I'm saying, because if you have common sense and you know how to do reading, which I'm not intending to imply that like those Christians who have that literalist theology don't know how to read, but I am kind of implying that. Like if you know how to read, you can tell when the language is shifting from like, you can tell when genres are shifting. You can tell that Genesis is a different genre than Micah or Joel. You could tell this is heightened poetic language in the Psalms versus I'm telling you this thing and this thing happened. Like you could tell you could tell
like the Gospel of Mark is like, Jesus went here, Jesus said this. Jesus went here, Jesus said this.
You could tell that like Samson approaches something of a myth because if you've read Greek myths, you know that versus like the way that Moses is talked about is a little more like this actually happened versus the way that Adam and Eve are talked about, which is like the Hebrew word for Adam is just mankind. So like if you're paying attention, the book that you're claiming to be literal is like shifting in and out of genres.
Well, and even evangelicals who claim it's literacy would say that it shifts in and out of genres. I think the disagreement would be where it shifts.
Sure.
Because even like young earth creationists would be like, oh yeah, there's poetry and there's metaphor, but Genesis 1 through 12 is literal. And you're like, is it?
And the argument being like, well, how can we take Jesus' resurrection to be literal? And you go, so because I have to take Jesus' resurrection to be literal, then everything else has to be?
Well, I think they would also point to Peter, who's like, just as, Noah entered the ark and was saved, so we can go through the ark of Jesus. And so, seriously, like that's one of the ones that they point to say, like the ark, like Noah's story has to be literal because, like, it's actually pointing. Like,
yeah. See, that's strange to me, and maybe this is just so common sense to me. I wonder if we'll never do it, but if we brought like a literalist, fundamentalist Christian on the podcast.
I mean, if you're out there and you're listening, I'm totally open.
Yeah, I'm open too, but I would just be like, I don't care that Peter was ignorant of modern science.
But he's divinely inspired, right? So,
and we've had this conversation so many times on our podcast. Like, so what? Like, I don't think that divine inspiration, it's an inner spiritual light thing. It's not like, if Peter thought that Noah's Ark was historical, then of course he thought that.
Right. And and his metaphor still holds.
Right.
Whether it was like it would actually happen or not.
The point he's trying to make in 1 Peter 3 holds.
Right.
The spiritual point he's trying to make holds no matter what. And so, I mean, even up until like the Copernican revolution, basically, Christians were like, yeah, that's what happened.
Right.
Not because they were like, we have to be literalist, but because that was
the history book.
That was it.
Yeah.
That was the history book.
Yeah.
Those debates didn't happen until somebody was like, oh, the universe is starting to look like it might be way older than we thought.
Right. And it turns out, like, the Earth doesn't look like it's in the center. Like,
right.
That's number one.
Right.
Right? And the Catholic Church is like, whoa, 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 whoa.
Right. Right. And all of a sudden you're like, your senses are at odds with, like, what was revelation, which before you didn't even conceive that could be possible.
Right.
So.
Yeah. Mormon missionaries, fun to talk to. I just back to Jehovah's Witnesses. Like they would just have always been so grumpy, and I think because it is more of a works-based religion, where like, not to say that Mormons aren't, but at the end of the day, they can baptize you without you knowing. But like Jehovah's Witnesses, like, which has also been funny because like only 144,000 people get to go to the highest heaven in the J-Dubs.
Yeah.
Right, and I'm like, don't tell anyone. Like you're messing up your chance to be. But also, the more people you see, like because it's a work-based religion, the better Jehovah's Witness you are, the higher up your stand. So it's like a double-edged sword, where like you're inviting people in, and if they come in, they might take your spot. But if you don't invite them in, you're definitely not getting a seat. Maybe that's why they're so grumpy. I don't know. I've met Jehovah's Witnesses not witnessing like at their conferences and stuff, because I used to work at the Mullen Center and we had their conference. We're very pleasant people, and outside when I've figured out that they're Jehovah's Witnesses from just regular, but like when they've come to my door, I'm just like, you don't really want to be here. Like like you want to hand me your track and get the heck out.
Yeah, I don't blame them, because that's just like an awkward social position to be in.
Yeah.
But they feel like it's something that they have to do.
Especially when, they also have to know that they're the butt of jokes about evangelism.
Right.
Like the whole joke is like, oh, Jehovah's Witnesses are at my door. And they're like, hey, we're Jehovah's Witnesses at your door.
Of course they know. My neighbor's a Jehovah's Witness, by the way, my next door neighbor. And one of the first things one of the first conversations that we had, and I was blown away, did not expect this. She says, I'll make you guys a deal, because she knew that I was a pastor. She's like, I won't talk about my religion if you don't talk about yours.
There you go.
And I was like, wow, I thought the deal would have went the other way. I thought you would have been more like, if you give me an hour, I'll give you an hour for every hour I give you. Which I would have preferred, because I like to talk about theology.
Right.
But the thing is, I don't actually like to talk about theology with Jehovah's Witnesses. You're right. Because it's never gone, there's no openness.
Well, unlike the Mormon missionaries who were kind of trained and then sent out, like when I've had conversations with Jehovah's Witnesses and they can't answer a question, this happened a lot more when I was a pastor. Like now I'm like, I don't have time for you. Yeah. But when I was a pastor, I'm like, come on in.
Yeah.
Like when they got to a question that they're like, I need to go ask the elder, I'll be back. Like there was no, like it would, like the conversation would stop instead of this like, oh, let's dialogue about that. They're like, whoa, I don't know. Like I gotta go.
Yeah, like the presumption that they're right and you're wrong never left. Right, so that makes conversation impossible.
Right.
The whole reason they're going, I have to go back to my elder, is because there is a right answer.
They just don't.
I just don't have it for
right.
you.
And I'll go get it.
And what you're saying is definitely wrong.
Right.
Which is like, why are we even talking then?
Yeah. Which we didn't get to. Why your interaction with the Elijah and Abraham was good was Elijah was open to having this conversation about what a false prophet is, and although he thought Joseph Smith was clearly a true prophet,
right?
Like there was a back and forth of like, false prophets can exist, and how do we figure out what they are within the theological constructs of Christianity / Judaism /
right. But Abe was like, once Abe realized that I was never ever going to convert. Right. Abe was like, we just need to get out of here because there's
time
somebody
to brush the dust off our feet.
Yeah, there's somebody down the street that might be more amenable,
and we don't want to miss them.
Which to me was sad because I was enjoying.
Yeah,
we were mutually enjoying our time together, and the most important thing to Abe was the numbers.
I mean, to be fair, it probably should have been the most important thing given his theological.
I get why.
Yeah,
but
yes, it cuts off the human aspect of it gets.
I think it comes down to, and it happens to be Mormonism, but I just think it comes down to like one of my biggest beefs with Christianity, evangelicalism, conservative evangelicalism is like how, at the end of the day, how could you be friends with anyone who wasn't a Christian? Because you could be as whimsical and amicable as you want to be. You can throw in relationship evangelism, but as soon as you draw that wall where my view of the world is definitely right, like definitely right, I'm not open to questioning it, there's no way you can actually have a genuine conversation with somebody else.
Well, everyone becomes a project.
Yeah, and I think that's really sad. Like you cut off yourself from being able to appreciate Bill and Steve cussing at each other.
Right.
Because your thought goes to, I wonder if Bill would have said that if he knew Jesus.
Right.
As opposed to,
that's hilarious.
I love this.
Yeah.
This is real human,
keen
life happening right in front of me.
Yeah. Which is a reference to our last one, but.
Yeah. Yeah. Well.
Yeah, I think that's it. Bill and Steve, Abraham and Elijah.
Bill and Steve. Bill and Steve are from Keene. Abe and Elijah.
What we should do is pair like Bill and Abraham and Elijah and Steve together and have like, that would just be an awesome odd couple podcast fodder. Like if we could actually find those people and put them in the same room.
We could do some cosplay. Actually, we don't even need the real Abe, or we could just get two other people and be
I'll work on my like middle American Dutch accent.
And you'd be like, okay, you're Abraham, you're Eli, you're Bill, and you're Steve, and then we'll just have to tell everybody that Bill and Steve are here, so this is no longer a PG-13 podcast.
That's right. On that note, thank you everyone for listening. Like, share, comment, send your support, your regrets. Any last words, Matt?
This coffee sucks.
Yeah. I'm pretty disappointed. It was $10 down the drain.
There it goes. All right, we love you.